Human trafficking. When it comes to human trafficking, children are worth less than animals. Human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to exploit a person for profit. It is also referred to as modern day slavery and varies in severity and purpose. 50% of its victims are less than 18 years old, and 75 consist of women and children. Human trafficking is a global crisis which affects underprivileged countries as well as privileged ones. The modern day slavery business cultivates a net worth of $9.5 billion annually. Places like Brazil, India, Burma, South Africa, Cambodia, and the United States are affected by trafficking at an alarming rate. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 300,000 children from the U.S. alone are at risk of being victims of human trafficking of some sort. This dilemma is happening right in our backyard to persons who are too young to understand what is happening to them, with little to no help after they are captured. Reading victim stories and following organizations' efforts to stop human trafficking make aware the power we possess to attain the same goal in ending this crisis. Two main purposes of the crisis are sex, where the victims are preferably under the age of 18, and labor services, which force individuals to work in horrible conditions and with little to no pay. Unfortunately, some are subjected to both. Traffickers do not discriminate against age, sex, or gender. However, majority of its victims are women and children between the ages of 4 years old and 30. Older victims used for labor as old as 60 years old. Although worldwide, impoverished countries are the most affected. Some women voluntarily enter the lifestyle to help their families but aren't aware of the dangers. They are brainwashed into thinking they get an out, a chance at a better life, which is never the case. Children are forced out of their homes by rebels and radicals to labor for causes they do not understand, nor benefits them. There is nothing like the death in the eyes of children inside these brothels who are just being serially raped, but when someone shows up to intervene on their behalf, I've seen life return to those same eyes, says Gary Huggan, president of the International Justice Mission. No matter the motive, each cause lasting psychological effects to these victims. As we'll see, human trafficking serves many different purposes to the perpetrator. In order to increase victim vulnerability, traffickers often travel with their victims to faraway destinations. This decreases the victim's chance of talking to anyone in a foreign land or escaping. Case in point, a story taken from an article called Trafficking in Persons report tells a story about 10 and 12-year-old sisters from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. They were trafficked to Germany, where the person who purchased them sexually abused them and documented it. Another victim, 14-year-old Ednita, was promised by her boss in Rwanda that if she traveled with his friend overseas, she would receive a great education and guaranteed safety. Something that never happened. Ednita was locked in a kitchen and used as a sex slave in Great Britain for 2 years before she escaped to authorities. Majority of trafficking victims are subjected to this life by people they know and trust. This is why it is so easy to get them to travel without a fight. Otherwise, their lives and that of their family members are threatened. The 10-year-old sisters from Cambodia mentioned prior were sold for money in exchange for sex by their own parents. Sadly, this is normal. Victims aren't only kept on land. They can be lured into working on fishing boats and other vessels on sea. This brings us to another purpose of trafficking, slavery. Another story taken from Trafficking in Persons report was a 6-year-old boy forced to work long hours and was paid $20 per year. When he did not do as well as expected, he was beaten, and brutalized. Russia is notorious for this type of victimization. Men between the ages of 18 and 50 are coerced into thinking that they are being recruited for work, but once on board are forced to work in brutal schedules with no pay and little food at gunpoint. Sleep deprivation are used to weaken them as well as psychological abuse. They are fed crab bait and drink melted ice water to survive. An example of this occurred in 2005, where several men were rescued when a vessel was being searched for illegally poached crabs. They were found dehydrated, starved, and exhausted under 3 tons of illegal poached crabs at the bottom of the ship's vessel. This is an unsettling crisis that still happens, and even more disturbing, it is happening to children. Most of us complain about a job we do not like or being ill-treated by our boss. It's nothing compared to the abuse experienced by trafficked victims for involuntary servitude. Unlike us, who get to go home at night, victims are subjected to work long hours in family homes with their passports confiscated and forbidden to leave the house. I read a book called A Walk Across the Sun by Corbin Addison, which, although beautifully written, it highlighted the horror that often occurs when natural disasters destroys communities. The book depicted the lives of two sisters who went through just that after being kidnapped from their homes when a tsunami hit their community and destroyed everything, taking the lives of their parents and other relatives, making them orphans. One of the orphan sisters, named Sita, was sold to a family in Paris after she was initially used as a drug mule for the trafficker. She was subjected to brutal working hours, like sleeping in her wet clothes on a cold kitchen floor with barely anything to eat. She was not allowed to eat anything and was emotionally and physically abused. After running away, Sita was threatened and sold to another family where she tried to run away again. Failing, again, she was then sold to a family in the United States, which spiraled into several events before she was rescued and reunited with her sister. Her sister, by the way, was a sex slave at a brothel in India, but was rescued before herself, Sita. Although the characters are fiction, it sheds light on horrible injustices that we aren't aware of. This occurs more than we know in the United States. Nigerian immigrants are often tricked into working for American couples who do not compensate nor come through on promises of a better life or even sponsorship. Instead, they are abused and brutalized. Women's rights are even less significant in places like Asia, are infamous for trafficking women into brokered marriages. In the last 5 years, brokered marriages rose from 43,121, of which 72% are South Korean men marrying foreign women against their will, according to NGO, the non-government organizations which help rescue women. Male victims are as great profit to the trafficking business as women are. Children soldiers are often doing the dirty work of militant groups such as the Mundundu 40. Child soldiering occurs in places like Sudan, Sierra Leone, where kids are barely big enough to hold guns. They are forced to years of war for these radical forces. They are also used as spies, miners, combatants, or served in forestry. War crimes are committed involuntarily by young boys, often where government officials cannot intervene due to weakened infrastructure. This leaves local organizations and programs fighting this epidemic on their own. You must be wondering, with all this information about human trafficking, why aren't authorities doing more to help these victims? Why isn't the government intervening in these brutal attacks against children and others affected? Other than lack of intel, many trafficking rings protect their business with force. Being a $9 billion business per year, they have managed to acquire the best protection money can buy, which is instilling fear. Families and victims are threatened if they go to authorities, who by which can do little to protect them nor their families. Even approaching prostituting women on the street would mean putting authorities' lives in danger. According to the Global Alliance, Trafficking Women, GAATW, which includes 100 NGOs, plans initiatives to distribute traffickers' operations can fail or even harm trafficked people, migrants, and women. Despite $120 million a year funding programs, most of the money does not reach the victims it's meant to help, due to lack of terms to operate by. Victoria Norgal, a GAATW board member, reported that only 47 of 777 victims received financial support from the Nigerian government. This prompted payments to victims to decrease $2,200 per person to $245 per person. Although funding goes into apprehending traffickers, charges rarely stick to the victims not willing to come forward out of fear. This results in traffickers getting off on serious crimes. Human trafficking occurs on U.S. soil more than we expect. Promises and continuous efforts are made to provide safety for those who chose to find solace here, but for some reason, such as statutes and government restrictions involving migrants, law enforcement officials are facing challenges when it comes to guarding our future generation from this ugly reality all around the world. Even though we cannot fully put an end to human trafficking, making it more difficult for them to abduct children can be just as efficient. Tips on identifying a traffic victim are recognizing signs of physical abuse, living with an employer, submissive or fearful individuals unable to speak for themselves, or under the age of 18 in prostitution. If you do get a chance to speak to an individual, questions like this should be asked: where do you eat? Where do you sleep? Do you have your passport identification? Have you been hurt or threatened if you attempt to leave? If these questions all have a negative response, the best thing to do is alert authorities. Never try to rescue a victim yourself. You could put yourself and the victim at risk. Calling 911 and organizations like the National Human Trafficking Resource Center is a national 24-hour helpline which can be reached at 888-373-7888. You can call this number to leave an anonymous tip, receive further training in anti-trafficking services, or general information. Human trafficking affects underdeveloped countries where the majority of victims are young women and children being manipulated by promises of a better life. Awareness brings about change and offers hope to victims. The law is meant to protect and regulate any given country and is often too efficient to individuals who are committing crimes against others.